6 sites, 6 levels. I've gone through internet history, court records, and documented investigations to compile the most disturbing platforms ever built in Liveleak's shadow. We'll start with the sites that first tested what the internet would allow, and descend into the ones that went so far they changed how governments think about online content forever. Let's begin at the tip of this iceberg. Case 1. For anyone wandering through the internet in the late 1990s and early 2000s, there was one name that carried a strange kind of reputation. It wasn't a website people casually recommended to friends. It wasn't something parents knew about. Instead, it spread through whispers, forum posts, and nervous dares between teenagers. That place was Rotten.com. At first glance, there was nothing particularly frightening about it. No dramatic graphics, no flashy design, no blood-red text screaming for attention. In fact, the site looked almost laughably plain. A blank white background, blue hyperlinks, the kind of layout that resembled an outdated government web page more than one of the most infamous destinations on the internet. But that simplicity only made it feel stranger. Launched in 1996 by former Apple and Netscape engineer Thomas E. Dell, who operated under the online alias Soylent, Rotten.com wasn't created merely to shock people. It was designed as a challenge, a deliberate test of how far freedom of expression could be pushed before someone stepped in and tried to stop it. At the time, lawmakers were attempting to regulate what could be published online through the Communications Decency Act. Many civil liberties advocates feared the law would open the door to widespread censorship. Rotten's creators saw an opportunity. If the government wanted to draw a line between what was acceptable and what wasn't, they intended to walk directly along that line. And they did. The site's strategy was deceptively simple. It focused almost entirely on material that was legal to publish, but deeply disturbing to look at. Public domain photographs, news images, medical records, crime scene documentation, historical atrocities, nothing technically illegal. Just things most people wished they had never seen. Visitors arriving on the homepage were greeted by a warning that felt less like website copy and more like an invitation into something they might regret. Beyond that warning sat a long list of links, each accompanied by a brief description. A visitor would click one out of curiosity, then another, then another. Before long, they would realize they had wandered somewhere they never intended to go. Rotten.com became a digital cabinet of horrors. And unlike horror movies, there was no comforting reminder that any of it was fiction. That realization often hit visitors like a punch to the stomach. For many young internet users, discovering Rotten.com felt almost accidental. A link from a friend, a mention on a message board, a challenge from an older sibling. They would sit down expecting something edgy or rebellious. Instead, they found themselves staring into humanity's darkest corners. As the site's notoriety grew, so did its appetite for disturbing material. When Princess Diana died in 1997, Rotten.com published an alleged photograph from the crash scene. The image later proved to be fake, but the controversy drove enormous traffic. Then came photographs from disasters, murders, autopsies, and terrorist attacks. Among the most haunting were images connected to September 11th, including photographs of people who jumped from the Twin Towers. By that point, Rotten.com had become more than a website. It had become a destination for morbid curiosity itself. Visitors could submit their own material through email. Some even requested that administrators locate graphic images unavailable anywhere else online. The result was an ever-growing archive that seemed dedicated to documenting humanity at its most broken, violent, and tragic. The deeper someone explored, the darker the material became. By the early 2000s, Rotten.com had attracted the attention of law enforcement agencies, foreign governments, and major corporations. Investigations were launched. Legal threats arrived. Critics demanded action. Yet, somehow, the site survived. Again and again, it managed to remain online, protected by the same free speech principles it had been created to test in the first place. That survival only added to its mythology. Rotten.com began to feel less like a website and more like a ghost haunting the early internet. No matter how many people condemned it, it remained there, waiting behind a simple white homepage and a collection of innocent-looking hyperlinks, year after year, a monument to humanity's fascination with the forbidden. Eventually, though, the internet changed. The updates slowed around 2009. By February 2012, the site had effectively gone silent. Case 2. Back in 2004, a man named Christopher Wilson launched a website out of Lakeland, Florida called NowThat'sFuckedUp.com. At first glance, it looked like just another corner of the early internet. A rough amateur site where users uploaded explicit photos and videos of themselves or their partners, while paying members gained access behind a subscription wall. In those early days, the site wasn't particularly remarkable. Wilson handled the technical side of things, hosting the content, maintaining the forums, and collecting subscription fees, but the material itself came directly from users. It was a community-driven platform built around people voluntarily sharing intimate content. Crude? Sure, but relatively ordinary by the standards of the internet at the time. The forums became the heart of the site. Public discussion boards sat alongside restricted sections reserved for paying members and top contributors. To outsiders, it looked like a typical online message board from the early 2000s. Then, something changed. By the middle of 2004, as wars continued raging in Iraq and Afghanistan, Wilson came up with what he viewed as a patriotic gesture. He began offering free premium memberships to deployed American troops. All they had to do was send photographs from the war zones. At first, the request sounded innocent enough. Pictures of military life, soldiers hanging out, equipment, living conditions, the kinds of photos families might expect to receive in letters back home. But once that door opened, it became impossible to close. Soldiers overseas quickly discovered the offer, and participation spread. Initially, many submitted harmless snapshots. Yet, buried among those images were glimpses of something darker, something far removed from the carefully managed version of war most Americans were seeing on television. Then, the photographs started getting worse. Far worse. Images began appearing that showed the aftermath of combat in brutal detail. Mangled bodies, human remains, scenes of death that most people would never encounter in their lifetimes. The photographs were raw, unfiltered, and often impossible to forget once seen. As more users arrived, the site transformed. What had once been an amateur adult content forum slowly became something much more disturbing. A place where images of real death circulated alongside explicit material. The boundaries between entertainment, curiosity, and human tragedy began to blur, and with each passing month, those boundaries seemed to disappear entirely. The contrast was chilling. While mainstream news outlets often shielded viewers from the graphic realities of the wars overseas, this obscure website exposed them in horrifying detail. Visitors could move from explicit forum threads to photographs of corpses with a single click. To many observers, it felt as though the site had become a kind of digital abyss, a place where violence was consumed the same way other people consumed entertainment. By 2005, journalists had begun investigating. Major media outlets published stories examining the site and the disturbing culture growing around it. Reports described a space where wartime death and internet voyeurism collided in deeply unsettling ways. Critics questioned whether viewers were becoming desensitized to real human suffering, treating scenes of conflict as little more than another form of spectacle. The attention only intensified the site's notoriety, but as public scrutiny grew, law enforcement was already moving closer. On October 7, 2005, deputies arrived at Wilson's home in Lakeland and arrested him. Strangely, it wasn't the war photographs that led to his downfall. Instead, authorities charged him over the sexually explicit content hosted on the site. A few days later, he posted bail and walked free. For a brief moment, it seemed the story might end there. It didn't. Investigators soon discovered Wilson continued operating the website despite the conditions surrounding his release. His bail was revoked, and he was sent back to jail. The walls were finally closing in. In January 2006, Wilson accepted a plea agreement. He pleaded guilty to several obscenity charges, avoiding hundreds of additional counts that prosecutors had prepared. The agreement came with strict conditions. He was prohibited from working on adult websites for years. The site itself had to be shut down permanently. And perhaps the strangest detail of all came afterward. Once the website was dismantled, Wilson was required to surrender the domain name itself to the Polk County Sheriff's Office. Today, the address that once hosted some of the Internet's most infamous content is controlled by law enforcement and displays an anti-pornography message instead. Case 3. When Best Gore first appeared on the Internet on April 30, 2008, it didn't arrive with much fanfare. There were no flashing warning signs announcing that it would become one of the most controversial websites of its era. But beneath its ordinary appearance lurked something far darker. Created by Mark Marek, the site quickly built a reputation as a destination for content most of the Internet wanted nothing to do with. Visitors who stumbled across it found themselves staring into a collection of humanity's most disturbing moments. Murders, suicides, torture, fatal accidents, graphic war footage, leaked documents, material that many people would spend a lifetime trying to avoid. For some, the site represented uncensored reality. For others, it represented something much more troubling. The deeper someone ventured into Best Gore, the more unsettling the experience became. What started as curiosity often transformed into discomfort, then disbelief, then something closer to dread. Unlike fictional horror, there was no safe distance separating viewers from what they were seeing. These weren't movie scenes or special effects. They were records of real suffering, preserved and displayed for anyone willing to look. And many people did. As the site's notoriety grew, so did the scrutiny surrounding it. By 2012, authorities had begun paying closer attention to Best Gore and its founder. Reports surfaced that investigators were examining the website's activities, particularly after it hosted footage connected to one of Canada's most infamous murder cases. The controversy pushed the site into an entirely new spotlight. Then, in July 2013, the situation escalated dramatically. Police charged Marek with a rare offense under Canadian law known as corrupting morals. The allegation centered on his decision to publish footage that investigators believed depicted a real murder. Authorities argued that he knew exactly what he was distributing when he made the material available online. It was an unusual charge, one that immediately attracted international attention. Law enforcement officials painted a grim picture of the website, describing it as a place saturated with violence and hateful content. To critics, Best Gore wasn't simply documenting horrific events, it was amplifying them. The legal battle that followed only deepened the sense that the site had wandered into dangerous territory. Marek was arrested, released on bail, then arrested again after allegedly violating conditions that prohibited internet access and cell phone use. For a brief period, he seemed to disappear from public view. Authorities issued warrants. Tips from the public poured in. Eventually, police tracked him down at a gas station in Alberta and took him back into custody. The story was beginning to feel less like an internet controversy and more like something pulled from a crime thriller. Yet, through it all, the website remained a source of fierce debate. Marek consistently defended his platform, arguing that exposing people to raw and uncensored material served a purpose. He claimed that mainstream audiences were often misled by manipulated videos and misleading narratives, while communities accustomed to examining graphic footage were sometimes better equipped to recognize altered or recycled content. Whether people agreed with him or not, his argument revealed something unsettling about the internet itself. The same archive that horrified countless viewers had also become, in the eyes of its supporters, a tool for analyzing information. That contradiction sat at the heart of Best Gore. In January 2016, the legal saga finally reached a conclusion. Marek pleaded guilty and received a sentence that included house arrest, followed by community service. Then, in November 2020, something unexpected happened. After more than a decade online, Best Gore ceased operations. Marek indicated that he had decided to move on and focus on other interests. A few days later, when someone asked whether the shutdown was permanent, the answer suggested there would be no return. And just like that, one of the internet's most infamous destinations faded into silence. Case 4. Among the many dark corners of the internet, few sites have earned a reputation quite like the NC.com. At first glance, it doesn't seem particularly unusual. Like countless other content-sharing platforms, it allows users to upload videos and images for others to view. The process is simple, almost deceptively so. People can submit material anonymously, hiding behind usernames or no identity at all. But that anonymity is exactly what gives the site its unsettling atmosphere. Because once the door is opened, almost anything can come through. The INC has long been known as a destination for graphic and controversial content. While moderators enforce certain rules and prohibit specific categories of illegal material, the content that remains is often disturbing enough to leave a lasting impression on anyone who encounters it. Visitors don't arrive there expecting funny videos or harmless entertainment. They arrive knowing they might witness something they can never unsee. At first, curiosity is usually what draws people in. Then, before long, many users find themselves wandering through a digital archive of humanity's most tragic and violent moments. One section may contain footage from devastating accidents, twisted vehicles scattered across highways, the aftermath of reckless decisions frozen in time. Another might feature recordings from crime scenes, capturing the grim consequences of violence long after the chaos has ended. Supporters sometimes argue that these videos serve as cautionary tales. They claim the footage forces viewers to confront realities that are often hidden from public view. Critics see something else entirely. To them, it feels less like education and more like spectacle, a place where suffering is consumed as entertainment. And that debate has followed the site for years. But the deeper someone explores, the darker the content often becomes. Among the most controversial material hosted on the platform are videos involving animal abuse and cruelty. These recordings have generated intense criticism from advocacy groups and viewers alike. Opponents argue that giving such material a platform risks normalizing acts that should be universally condemned. The existence of those videos raises an uncomfortable question. At what point does documenting cruelty become enabling it? But the site is designed in a way that encourages wandering deeper. Its structure feels almost labyrinthine. Some content is openly accessible, while other sections remain hidden behind registration requirements. One of the most talked about areas is a members-only section known as the Underground. The name itself feels ominous, like descending another level beneath an already dark surface. For some visitors, simply knowing that hidden content exists becomes enough to spark further curiosity. Online discussions frequently revolve around ways to access these restricted areas, creating an air of mystery around what might be waiting behind those locked doors. And often, the imagination proves just as unsettling as reality. Case 5. At first glance, Watch People Die looked like just another internet forum. The layout was familiar. The discussion boards were neatly organized. Users created accounts, shared posts, and interacted with one another much like they would on countless other websites across the internet. But beneath that ordinary surface was something far more unsettling. Watch People Die, often shortened to WPD, built its identity around real-world death and extreme violence. Every video represented a real victim. Every image documented a real tragedy, and over time, that constant exposure began to shape the environment surrounding the platform. The site originally existed as a subreddit on Reddit, where it attracted a large audience fascinated by graphic content. But in 2019, after footage from the Christchurch Mosque massacre was uploaded and circulated, Reddit permanently banned the community. For many platforms, that would have been the end. For Watch People Die, it was only a transition. The community rebuilt itself as an independent website, recreating much of the same structure and culture it had before. To casual visitors, it still resembled a typical discussion forum. But researchers would later discover that something darker had begun taking root inside its walls. The violence was no longer just on the screen, it was beginning to seep into the conversations. According to investigations conducted by extremism researchers, Watch People Die became a place where graphic footage and extremist ideology increasingly overlapped. A visitor might arrive looking for shocking videos and, without realizing it, find themselves surrounded by propaganda, manifestos, and communities dedicated to glorifying mass killers. The shift was subtle at first. Then the pattern became impossible to ignore. Researchers uncovered a tightly connected network of users who openly celebrated white supremacist ideology and idolized individuals responsible for some of the deadliest acts of extremist violence in recent history. Their profiles were filled with references to mass killers. Their discussions revolved around manifestos. Their communities rewarded admiration for violence rather than condemning it. The deeper investigators looked, the more disturbing the picture became. Then came a discovery that transformed the issue from an online concern into a real-world tragedy. Two school shooters, separated by only a few weeks, shared a connection to the same online ecosystem. Both had created accounts on Watch People Die in 2023. Both spent months participating in extremist communities. Both eventually embraced white supremacist beliefs, and both later carried out deadly attacks before taking their own lives. The timeline cast a long shadow over the platform. Researchers were careful not to claim that the website alone caused these acts of violence, but what they found was deeply troubling. The shooters had become embedded within a network that normalized hatred, celebrated mass murderers, and constantly circulated graphic content depicting real-world bloodshed. In many ways, the violence served as a gateway. People arrived seeking shock. Some stayed long enough to find ideology. Inside these circles, extremist killers were not discussed as criminals or cautionary tales. Instead, they were elevated into symbols. Their photographs became profile pictures. Their manifestos were shared like sacred texts. Their attacks were dissected, praised, and sometimes even transformed into fan-made tributes. The result was a culture that felt increasingly detached from reality. One researcher described an ecosystem where users were connected not only by shared interests, but by a mutual fascination with violence itself. Certain accounts became influential hubs, spreading content throughout an interconnected web of followers who reinforced one another's beliefs. The atmosphere resembled an echo chamber. Only instead of amplifying opinions, it amplified extremism. Videos of mass killings accumulated hundreds of thousands of views. Footage originally recorded by attackers themselves was preserved and shared repeatedly. Some posts compiled dozens of attacks into enormous archives, turning acts of terror into bingeable content. Researchers also discovered large collections of extremist manifestos available without context or criticism. Anyone could access them. Anyone could read them. There were no warnings explaining the misinformation or hateful ideology contained within their pages. Some users openly expressed admiration for attackers. Others declared them sources of inspiration. Researchers found examples of individuals praising their beliefs, celebrating their actions, and encouraging others to learn more about them. In certain corners of the community, the obsession went even further. Some users expressed romantic or sexual attraction toward mass killers. Others created artwork portraying them in deliberately cute or harmless ways, stripping away the reality of their crimes and replacing it with a bizarre form of idolization. The effect was surreal. A place originally built around watching death had gradually evolved into something even more disturbing. A place where death was admired, where violence was normalized, where the perpetrators of atrocities were transformed into icons. And perhaps the most unsettling part was how ordinary it all appeared from the outside. The site still looked like a forum. The posts still looked like discussions. The users still looked like internet users chatting behind screens. Yet, beneath that familiar surface existed a world where repeated exposure to violence blurred moral boundaries, where extremist ideas circulated freely, and where real human suffering became background noise. Case 6. The name Ogrish.com carried an unsettling meaning long before most people ever visited the site. According to its own FAQ, the name came from the old word ogrish, sometimes spelled ogresh, meaning something resembling an ogre. Older dictionaries described it as cruel, brutish, monstrous, or hideous. It was an unusually fitting name, because once visitors stepped inside, they quickly discovered they had entered a corner of the internet that seemed dedicated to documenting humanity at its absolute worst. At first, Ogrish presented itself as something of a challenge. The site's early slogan essentially dared visitors to test their limits. It wasn't simply asking people to browse, it was asking them whether they could stomach reality itself. Most people probably thought they could. Then they started clicking. What they found was a collection of content that few websites were willing to host. Graphic footage from wars, images of executions, industrial accidents that ended in catastrophe, scenes of violence so disturbing that many visitors closed their browsers almost immediately. Others stayed, and the longer they stayed, the darker the experience became. Unlike many shock sites of the era, Ogrish wasn't built around fictional horror. Everything was presented as real suffering, real death, real moments captured at the exact second someone's life changed forever. That reality gave the site an atmosphere that felt uniquely disturbing. Every image carried the weight of knowing that somewhere, beyond the screen, there were victims, families, and lives that had been permanently shattered. As the site's reputation spread, controversy followed close behind. One of the most troubling aspects was its willingness to publish graphic footage without the consent of victims' relatives. Families often had no control over how images of their loved ones were being viewed, shared, or discussed by strangers across the world. The ethical questions surrounding the site grew louder with every passing year. Then came a series of events that pushed Ogrish even further into the spotlight. In 2002, the site became known for displaying graphic photographs connected to the September 11th attacks, including images many mainstream outlets refused to publish. For some visitors, it was the first time they had seen the full horror of that day. 2 years later, another storm erupted. In the summer of 2004, Ogrish uploaded footage showing the execution of South Korean hostage Kim San-il. The video spread rapidly online and triggered outrage across South Korea. Hackers repeatedly targeted the site, and anger toward Ogrish intensified as many questioned whether such footage should ever have been made publicly available. The site had crossed another line, and people around the world had noticed. By 2005, authorities in Germany began taking action. A youth protection organization determined that the site's graphic material violated German regulations concerning age verification and access restrictions. What happened next was unusual. When steps were taken to block access to Ogrish through a major telecommunications provider, the effects spread far beyond Germany's borders. Users in multiple European countries suddenly found themselves unable to reach the site. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that Ogrish might finally disappear behind digital barriers. It didn't. Instead, the site adapted. By early 2006, Ogrish underwent a dramatic transformation. The dark, image-heavy layout that had defined its identity was stripped away and replaced with a cleaner, faster design. On the surface, the change made the site appear more professional, but underneath, larger changes were taking place. The administrators began shutting down some of the site's most notorious sections. Areas known for hostile behavior and extreme content were removed or replaced. New forums appeared. Old communities vanished. Rules changed. For the first time, Ogrish seemed to be trying to distance itself from the image that had made it infamous. Yet, there was a strange feeling hanging over the transition. The graphic material never truly disappeared. Instead, it became compartmentalized, moved into opt-in sections where users could still seek it out if they chose. The site's public face was changing. Its shadow remained. Then, in late 2006, something even bigger happened. Visitors who typed ogrish.com into their browsers suddenly found themselves redirected elsewhere. The destination was a newly launched platform called Liveleak. At first, it seemed like a natural evolution. Liveleak focused heavily on user-submitted videos and quickly gained popularity by allowing content to spread across the internet in ways that older sites never could. But in many ways, it also inherited Ogrish's legacy. The same fascination with raw, unfiltered reality. The same willingness to show events that traditional media often avoided. The same uneasy feeling that somewhere between journalism and voyeurism, a line had become increasingly difficult to see. For nearly 15 years, the old Ogrish domain continued redirecting visitors toward its successor. Then, in 2021, Liveleak itself disappeared, transforming into a new platform called Itemfix.